I was very worried about the situation in Ukraine. I'm very worried about Ukrainian people. My thoughts are with them right now.
Today I wanted to talk about what's going on with the war in Ukraine from an alliance point of view, specifically NATO. On May 18, the Swedes and the Finns submitted a joint application to join the NATO alliance. To the excitement of many countries around the region, including the Germans, including the French, including the Brits, including the Americans and the Canadians. Even the Italians seemed really excited. But one country did not, and that one country is Turkey. Now, the Turks charge that there are a number of countries out there, including most notably Sweden, who have been providing too much assistance to groups that the Turks don't much care for. The group in question are the Kurdish militias that operate not just in Turkey, but specifically in Syria, and who have been part of the Syrian civil war now since its beginning about, 7 years ago now? The Turks say that as long as countries are funding or arming or politically supporting groups that are shooting at Turks, they can't be considered allies. Now, while the big issue of the day remains Russia and the Ukraine war, the Turks have a point. It's difficult to imagine countries being militarily allied with countries who are then working to undermine their own security. And in the NATO alliance, each individual country has full veto power over who can join. So if the Swedes and the Finns cannot have a heart-to-heart with the Turks over what is possible and what is not possible, the Swedes will not get in. Just as Russia is an issue of paramount import to the Swedes, the Finns, the Poles, and others, Turkey considers the Kurdish issue to be an issue of paramount import. And since they have veto power, they will use it unless they get their way. What the Swedes and the Finns are discovering is that if you want to be part of an alliance, you have to make your peace with everyone who is there already. And that encourages countries to see the world through the eyes of other places. One of the reasons why the American alliance system has been so successful going back to the 1940s is that the Americans are pretty good at this because they have their fingers in a lot of pots. And so it's easy for us as Americans to understand the security concerns of Poland and Japan at the same time because we're active in both places. But the reverse is not necessarily true. The Poles don't understand the security implications of Japan or Korea and vice versa because they have no interest in that area. So it's very easy for these countries to play it fast and loose in someone else's region and really not care. NATO makes this a little bit more awkward because the NATO alliance is now 30 countries and they have interests in Africa, they have interests in the Caribbean, they have interests in South America, they have interests in the former Soviet space. And it takes the United States to kind of corral the cats, so to speak, to make sure that everyone is seeing everything from everyone's point of view. And it doesn't always work. But for Sweden and Finland, this is a first. Sweden has been out of the great power game since the Napoleonic Wars. Finland hasn't been in the great power game at all. Their only concern has always been Russia. And they are going to have to find a way to pacify the Turks, and that probably means throwing the Kurds under the bus. And sorry to the Kurds, this has happened over and over and over in history, but in order for the NATO alliance to get what it wants, in order for the Swedes and the Finns to get what they want, they're going to have to see this from Turkey's point of view. Now, this is hardly a new concept. It happens anytime there's an alliance that touches more than one region. I think the Quad in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean is a great example. Now, the Quad is an informal grouping of 4 countries, India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, with kind of the United Kingdom as a off-again, on-again member, that is designed primarily to hedge in the Chinese, to exchange political and technological information in order to work towards that goal. Now, the Australians have been working with the Americans for a very long time. They understand that the Americans have fingers in a lot of pots and are usually pretty good at understanding different points of view. The Japanese, less so. They used to have an extra-regional empire that was destroyed in World War II, and they've kind of spent the rest of the time since then cowering in the Americans' shadow. That started to loosen up a little bit, And the Japanese government has flat out paid extortion money to the Trump administration in order to make sure they were still part of the American alliance structure. So there's an understanding in Tokyo that if the Americans say something is good and needed to be done, the Japanese pretty much snap to. Great example there would be the sanctions on Russia. Japan, despite trying to be neutral on all things Russia since World War II, was the third country to sign up for the sanctions package, which leaves India. India is an independent pole in international affairs. They have a country that they're really concerned about too, really, Pakistan and especially China. And it doesn't really sink in with the Indians that there are other countries that might have concerns. So the Indians have turned into the biggest sanctions buster of the Ukraine war so far. Even the Chinese are drastically reducing their imports and exports to and from Russia. But the Indians are doing the opposite, because they have not learned that an alliance means you have to see the world through someone else's eyes. So Sweden, India, same general problem. And at some point, they're going to decide that partnership with other countries is worth them swallowing some policies that those other countries don't much care for. For the Turks, it's the Kurds. For the Indian, it's going to be the Russians. We're not there yet, but we're getting there pretty quick, because deglobalization is picking up speed and international supply chains are breaking down. And countries very soon are going to have to pick sides and decide what it is that they can live with and what it is they can live without. And that's as true for foreign policy and morals as it is for semiconductors and cars. That's where we're headed. Okay, so my projection here is that the Swedes will abandon the Kurds and that the Turks will approve Swedish and Finnish membership in NATO. But they've got to have that conversation first. The first round of that started this week. Negotiations next week probably will get us exactly what we need. There's an interest on both sides for this being resolved quickly. All right, that is it from me. Until next time.
This is just a couple of graphics I pulled from the new book that comes out in June. The dotted lines are what matters here. Dotted lines are when shale became the majority of American energy production, and you can see how radically it changed things. So on the top two, so on the left you've got coal, on the right you've got natural gas. Once natural gas was competing with coal in a very big way, that's the top left, production just dropped off. Hard to compete with free. And on the right, you can see where all that natural gas radically increased production, the blue line, and how it started pulling away from total consumption, the orange line. And we started becoming the world's second largest exporter of natural gas, most notably pipes to Mexico, but also a significant amount of LNG. And we even have a couple of pipes up into Canada, of all places now. The bottom right, same idea, but with crude. The blue is what used to be imports. The orange is exports, and you can see that a few years ago, the lines crossed. Now, we did have a quick recombining during COVID briefly, but those have already widened back. I just don't have good enough data because the United States Department of Energy reports data differently from everyone else. We don't report crude oil production. We report refinery production, because in the eyes of the DOE, no one uses crude, people use refined product. I can see the logic, but nobody else does that. So it makes it an apples and oranges comparison, which is a real pain in the ass. And we have to wait for someone else to report American data in order to get something that's actually useful for comparison purposes. Bottom line, shale good. Canada good too. The Canadians started in roughly 1980 to crack the code on something we now know as tar sands, or the oil sands. That's the orange output. That's entirely from Alberta, with maybe a little bit from Saskatchewan. The blue is their more conventional crude. And as you can see, the orange is now as big as the blue. Now, the Canadians have probably peaked out. They have had the same issues going on in their oil patch that everywhere else in the world, where people are like, oh, oil bad. And so investment is kind of flatline. So that 5.5 number, million barrels per day, that's about where they've been now for the last year and a half. I don't expect it to get very big, any much bigger than that very soon. 3 to 8 years to bring a project online. That's just the world we're in. And they have nowhere to send it. You'll notice that all of the shale fields are between the Rockies and the Appalachians. And this is where Keystone was supposed to go. So the economic argument, especially in a world where the United States is restricting exports, the economic argument for Keystone is a little questionable, because they would be running a crude line into the most supersaturated oil markets in the world in order to get it to Houston, where it could then be refined. So all of the value add is done in the United States, and American refineries will then be able to send that product wherever they want. But Albertan crude production has to compete with US crude prices. And whereas the break-even price for American shale is now sub 50, the break-even price for Albertan crude is above 70. And the economics for it don't make a huge amount of sense anymore. I think they missed their window on that, unfortunately. So it's going to be all US shale all the time for the US market. Love this graphic. Okay. There's a whole mess of things going on in here. First of all, the blue are fields or crude sources that I do not expect to be restricted in any meaningful way. And in the upper left-hand corner, the ones that have the slash through them, those are the US major shale projects. Overall, this is talking about crude quality. So if you're in the upper left, you're talking light crude, sweet crude, which is a way of saying it has almost no contaminants. And it's usually the color and consistency of nail polish remover. It's very easy to refine. And historically speaking, that crude has sold at a significant premium to other crude grades. If you move to the bottom right, that's heavier crude, lots of contaminants, and usually that's the thick, gooey stuff that we normally think of when we think of crude oil. Here on the right, it has few contaminants, but it's still pretty thin. If you're on the bottom left, it doesn't have very many contaminants, but it's fairly thick. This matrix is how every refinery in the world has to plan. Most refineries can only run a very specific type of crude, sometimes from a specific oil field. The chemical composition of all the crudes is very different place to place. Now, with the world I anticipate, where we're going to have a lot more military confrontations in a lot more places, the Ukraine war is just the first of many. Anything in blue is fine. Anything in green is probably fine. But by the time you get to the oranges, and especially the reds, we should not count on that crude getting out in large volumes on a regular basis. Give you an idea of where we are, Urals is right now orange. We'll see if that holds, because I anticipate at some point the European coalition is probably going to break and allow some more Urals to get out, allowing the Russians to at least export half of what they've got. But this is the sort of thing that when I put this in front of a bunch of refinery, we really hope, when I put this when I put this chart in front of refiner operators, where they have to run their entire business plan on what type of crude they can get, they really have to schedule those events on the ground floor, because this will make some of them borderline suicidal. You're talking about billion-dollar investments they have made in order to run a very specific crude grade. And for half of them, what they have hoped for is simply going to go away. Now, you can retool your refineries to run a different grade, but then you're running that grade and you're just as vulnerable, but to a different input source. The bigger your system, the more crude grades you can access. The more you can blend two things to get something that's more approximate to what you need, the better you're going to be. The United States doesn't do a lot of that right now, but we're going to be getting into it in a very big way once we have that export ban, because then we're going to have a lot of light sweet in the neighborhood because of shale, and we're still going to have a fair amount of heavy sour because of the Canadians, and we're going to be able to muddle through, and we're going to be able to muddle through in an environment of a super saturated crude market. That'll keep prices more accessible. But if you move over into, say, East Asia, you're lucky to get whatever you can get. And you're going to have to run it through your refinery and do a lot of repairs, because it will trigger a lot of damage. And then you're going to have something called run loss, which is just what it sounds like. You can't get 100% of the crude to give you product. You're probably only getting like 80 to 90%.